am Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years, and today I have my special guest, the author of several books, and of course, best-selling author too, no other than Miss Sapha Burnell. Miss Burnell, how can you effectively build tension and conflict within the limited space of a short story?
The first thing I like to do when you have, say a 5,000 word story. So something that's not, not micro, not flash, but it's still, it's still a short story. I like to use the setting. So we walk into a room. To one person, they're walking into a room. The walls are pink. There's a bright circle of white light at the top from this incredible kind of almost neon source. There's a non-linear shaped desk, so it's a little bit more kind of organic and things like that. They walk in and they go, "Oh my goodness, this is such a nice place. I feel so cheerful." And they set that mood for themselves with how that character experiences the space. Somebody else walks in and it's like a vampire going into the sun. Oh my gosh, what's going on? You've got the throb of their eyes at both the color and the nature of the light. They've got that sense of like, well, this isn't the way an office is supposed to be, and all of a sudden, so you're building tension by how characters are experiencing the same thing. Because then too, it's a little bit more, what's the right word? It's cost effective in word count. You're only explaining one room, but the two people's experiences of it all of a sudden gives you an instant kind of payout on where both people are and what they're going through in their minds and the whole thing. So that's one way I like to build tension. Another way is a little bit more on the poetry side. As the fiction gets shorter, I do believe you can add in more and more kind of poetry style types of ideas. And that's the repetition of a certain line. And this one phrase or this one line, it's changing meaning every single time you hear it. And it's done so well in poetry and things, just having that one line at the end of a stanza return. But because of what's happened in the stanza, that line starts morphing. No, the line hasn't changed, but its meaning has. And so I think that in shorter fiction, you can do that kind of thing more often. Bring back that image that you had in, say, the introduction or right at the beginning. And then as it starts to morph, you're building this tension and building this sort of grip with the readers. Now, it can be done too much. It can be like, oh my goodness, yes, I know. The ducks are in the pond. I get it. But I do love that subtle repetition. It's just gorgeous. Um, Another way I like to develop tension is just through the conversations. So, obviously dialogue is an important thing. You don't need dialogue in order to build tension, just saying, but you can kind of put a conversation in a blender and add espresso in a short story. You have more license to believably go from 1 to 90 on the scale of emotional intensity and back. You can have those waves that I like to put in my fiction of highly tense, very evocatively emotional moments, and then the relief later on, which is usually a place of calm or a place of humor. I find calm a little bit more medium, but humor can kind of really break the tension and then, whew, yay, okay, I can handle more now. You can have those waves be so much more intense with short fiction because people are reading it with that held breath. It's a 90-minute movie, not the entire season of a TV show. So you've got things a little bit more fast, a little bit quicker. You can kind of get into things, with Whiskey and Sinner's Blood. When I built the tension between, Carolee and her husband, Colm, it started off as just a man coming home with a bottle of whiskey and his wife being like, he brought me a gift. What did he do? And it's this almost completely normal conversation at the beginning until the tension ramps up with Colm admitting that he promised their son to the Fairy Queen. And all of a sudden there's that stillness. And all of a sudden that kitchen knife that she has been, touching or holding because she was making dinner, he walks in and she's cutting vegetables. So, he takes the knife out of her hand and he puts it down and he goes, "Let me get you some whiskey." And she's like, "Okay, what did you do?" But that image of the knife is brought back about 3 times in that conversation. Twice, without Carolee really thinking about it, without any intention there. And then the third time, that intention was very firm with Carolee's character. And that's how I like repetition. Every single time you see it, something has changed. When you're building tension, intention of the character matters. If the character's just kind of going through it and it's just, they're just sort of existing within this thing and all this stuff is outward kind of happening to them, then that's only going to build so much tension. But the second something happens and it is that character's doing, or it's that character's kind of mindset that is bringing them to that space, all of a sudden the tension is ramped up.
Interesting, Miss Burnell. So, what techniques can you use to create a vivid and immersive settings in a short story?
The first thing I like to do, now this is not essential. I talk about this with people who write. Okay, so people who write science fiction and fantasy, it's a little different from people who are writing, other kinds of fiction. Um, the number one thing I like to do is think of a place I've been. It is so much easier, in my opinion, to create that space while thinking of a place I have legitimately inhabited. Not for long. Maybe it's a place I was only in for, 45 minutes to an hour sometime on a vacation, a coffee shop in, by Kensington Park, or maybe it's a bit of hallway in a business tower where you had to go to, have a job interview, that kind of thing. But I always like to at least attempt to have a place in mind that I can kind of restructure somewhere I've been. And I find that when you are not just fabricating a space out of midair, you can fabricate elements out of it, but you still have that sense of habitation. You have that sense of, grounded nature. It's so, Carolee, going back to Whiskey and Sinner's Blood, Carolee and Colm's kitchen, it has the rickety table from the 70s that they got as a hand-me-down when they got married in the 90s. It's got, the kind of almost paisley wallpaper that the early 90s in Ireland had going on. It's got the sink board beside the stove a little bit rickety. It's got those things that reminded me of my kitchen when I was in my grandma's house growing up in the 90s. But it's a place that I've kind of been. I can visualize it in my head. I understand where those, those little beats are happening within the space. And then from there, I'm building more things to it. Oh, there's a back door and a side door. There's this, there's that. Okay, those things are different. But I'm using the groundwork, the foundation of a place that I've been, and then adding the fantastic on top of that. Now, I do the same thing with science fiction. I start with that sensation of a room. Maybe it's not the entire room and it's not made of, stucco and lumber and drywall. It's made of some odd polymer they got from an alien race that started trading with humanity. Maybe this room is completely different, but there is still that organically shaped desk. There is still that light that looks like a planet inside a nebula. There's still some recognizable things to sort of ground and attach people in. Because what I find happens otherwise, especially in fantasy and science fiction, that's when, and mostly in fantasy, I should say, because science fiction, you can still kind of make things parallel to this world a lot more. Most of the time, when I see a setting that's not working in fantasy specifically, it's because they're just, kind of subconsciously trying to do that. But no, they're recreating everything. No, you don't understand, because this place has this and this and this and this. How does that work? And when you push on it a little bit, it's almost like a house of cards. And then the setting starts falling apart because really their mind wants to connect with something we've already seen. Your reader's mind wants to connect with an experience that it can share. Yes, it's reading. Reading fiction is about expanding oneself and about learning more and enriching our lives and, experiencing the titivation of good fiction, experiencing, all of these amazing kinds of stories and having that moment of escapism. But humans are wonderful pattern recognizers. And if there's a pattern present, we want to make sure in our fiction that it's intentional. And so we already know where we've grounded it. Then we can kind of work from there and add those fantasy elements to make sure that that they fit within the world.
So, Miss Burnell, is it essential to have a clear resolution in any short story? Or it can be end of ambiguity?
Okay, so there's a couple ways of looking at this. Uh, something has to change by the end of a story. Even if, let's say we're talking Caleb Malthuson's story, like the Lamia. Yes, in the beginning of the story and in the end of the story, Caleb Malthuson will have come from his home where his daughters are, and then he will return to his home where his daughters are. So nothing that way has changed. There's parallel motion where that's concerned. He's still the same person, basically, both ends of the story. He is this, judge from the Judge of Mystic Saga. He is this man going around attempting to make sure that he can keep the peace and he can keep magic out of Midgard, magic that will harm anybody out of Midgard. All of that stuff is the same. There's no resolution to that. There's nothing. You can have that be the same. But through the course of the Lamia, his mental landscape changes a great deal. And so there has to be something that changes, whether it's a motivation, whether it's a psychological frame of mind, whether it is the decision to go back to a situation that's not as awesome, or whether it's the decision to return to something that is awesome and not run away from it. Whatever it is, if you're not going to have that resolution be within an external case of the plot, then you need to have some form of internal resolution, or unless you're writing something a little bit more dark or grimdark or a little bit closer to horror, because in horror you can leave things on that thin, shrill violin note of tension and then just have it end. You can do that in horror because it's meant to unsettle somebody. But the thing that writers need to remember is it's meant to unsettle somebody. If nothing has happened, if things are just going back to the same thing that they were doing before, if nothing structurally or mentally or emotionally has changed or developed, then that's more likely going to either unsettle a reader, which can be used to great effect and can be a good storytelling device, or it's going to make that reader feel like that's kind of the moment. Yeah, I personally experienced is in editing short fiction, where readers go, what was the point of that? Why did I read that story? What, like, oh my gosh, what is that? That's usually the readers who'll disconnect because there's not enough resolution. There's not enough of something in the end. At least if you're writing a story about a woman who's attempting to leave her broken marriage, and by the end of the story, she walks by and she's got her bag of things and she's going to do it. She's going to get on that bus. She's going to leave and she's never going to come back and he's never going to find her and she's done. And she walks by, and by the end of that short story, she crosses the street, goes into the dry cleaner, picks up his dry cleaning and takes it home. And she's lost her resolve. She still had that moment of resolve to lose. There is still motion there, even though she ended up not leaving that marriage, and she ended up doing the same thing she always does, picking up his dry cleaning and taking it home. And she's going to hang that up. That she's going to start making dinner. That all of that stuff is going to remain the same. But mentally, she has found a reason for it, or, in some cases, she's given up, but there's still motion there.
Very well said, Miss Burnell. But before we go on, I want to shout out to the people listening in Japan, because according to my feedback, I have a lot or new listeners in Japan. Because in Tokyo, I got 67% audience share. Aichi at 11%, Miss Miyazaki at 4%, Gafu at 2%, Yogo at 2%, Kumamoto at 2%, Kanagawa, Hokkaido, and a lot more. Arigato gozaimasu. Hi, Japan, for supporting this podcast, because this podcast is created to empower writers all over the world, like Miss Sapha Burnell. Arigato gozaimasu. So, Miss Burnell, how do you handle pacing in a short story to maintain reader engagement?
Okay, so for pacing, I make sure that every paragraph in a short story, something happens that moves things along. Within a novel, it's every chapter, something happens that something moves along. You've got a little bit more space to kind of linger on something. But in a short story, I'm making sure that every paragraph or two, there is something that's different. I'm not just spending 3, 4, 5 paragraphs necessarily setting some form of scene that, just kind of sits there. And then 10 paragraphs later, we see some motion. We don't have time for that. So we want to set the established stuff in the beginning of where we're at. What's going on? Where's that initial spark of the story, whether it's in medias res or we're starting at very much at the beginning? We are setting that kind of moment of stillness in the beginning. And then we can go from there and pop in all of these different changes, whether it's a conversation or a line of thought, or, a shadow in the corner, or whether it's the metaphor of, say, in Clarice Lispector's story, a cockroach that's found in the maid's room after the maid has left, that something has happened. There's realizations, even if everything happening is in the mental landscape of the character, if we're in first person, or if we're really tight inside a character's head, and we are able to see, inside their mind and their motivations. And even if there's just, every paragraph, there's something added, taken away, or modified to the original goal. And that's how I track pacing. Most of the time, I'm also looking at settings where, unless you're going incredibly poetic, I'm looking at settings where people are. I like to engage with settings where a character is physically doing something within them, not just being present, unless the story calls for that, but really doing something in it, like somebody throwing the door open into their bedroom, throwing their jacket down, their keys, their wallet, everything else, and tossing themselves onto the bed. And you get a sense of this space, the one overhead light he turned on as he threw himself onto the Spider-Man bedspread, that he'd had since he was 12. And it didn't matter if he was 27, he still kind of liked it. And all of these different things. Like, I am using interaction with the space to provide information about the space, because that's inherently more interesting right away. you
Definitely.
know.
What are some tips you are crafting realistic dialogue in a short story?
How do people talk? How do people
Yes,
talk?
definitely.
Listen to conversations you've actually had in your head. And I'm not saying here what some people do where, oh yeah, just, write down conversations you've had and use those. No. I'm sorry. If everybody in your life thinks that you're writing down everything for a story, they're going to start shutting up. you know, Christmas might be a time for family, but that family is going to be staring at you from across the room. Um, no. Um,
Is that gossiping or not?
yeah, exactly. It's gossiping to the entire world. Um, oh man, that is actually something to talk about with memoir too.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
but listen to how people talk. They'll drop words, they'll things like that. I think, you know, especially if somebody has characters in their book that are not necessarily reflective of their personal experience and how they talk and their dialect, it becomes even more important to have people in your life who are of that dialect. When it comes to when dialogue where I have, say, somebody from the north of England, I've got friends and compatriots in Yorkshire and in Manchester that'll be like, hey, I'm working on the scene. Can you read this over for me? Oh yeah, mate. No, we don't talk like that. And all of a sudden they're going to change words here and there. And, they're going to be like, you know what? Use this idiom. We really like this one. They're going to make it more authentic to those voices. And I think with dialogue, the thing that I find the most strained is when people go into their head and go, well, I watched a film once that had this kind of person talking in it. So I'm going to use that kind of dialogue because I saw it in a film or I saw it on a TV show or, I saw it on a YouTube video. So that must be how people talk. But if you've never experienced, people outside of your little, your bubble, that we all have bubbles of varying degrees, then you don't really know if that's third, fourth, fifth, or sixth hand information. So you need to find people who talk the way you want your characters to talk and make friends. I know it's a little bit hard for some authors to kind of get out there and find these communities. I find Discord to be amazing for that. Also, Twitch. There is a vibrant writing community on Twitch, and it is full of every kind of person you can imagine. And there are so many Discord servers full of authors and of writers and people who just love to read, who are there to be like, hey, yeah, what do you need? What do you want? Let's talk it out. Let's see how this goes. Well, you see, we don't really use that language here. Or, oh, yeah, I had this the other day. There was this exchange in my Discord server where two people were talking. One of them was a younger person, and the other one was older. And the younger person went, oh man, that's so lit. My mom talks like that. And the older person was like, what? It's like, oh yeah. And then all of a sudden, the most Zoomer stuff came out of this younger person's chat. And the other person was like, and they required translation. But that person had been writing a story with a Zoomer in it and didn't know any of the lingo. Well, you need to talk to a Zoomer. You need to actually communicate with somebody that, has that kind of tone, that uses those idioms, that has that frame of speech, that has that, dialect within them. Like, that's part of the research of being a writer. As much as it's a wonderful solitary thing where you can sit in front of a computer and create entire worlds and universes, with a couple clicks of a fingers or the stroke of a pen, you need to get out there. And if you cannot get out there physically, you cannot go see the world on a whistle stop tour of every single continent, then the internet is a fantastic place for that. Listen to podcasts, go into Discord servers, make some friends, say hi to people. I will guarantee you, as much as you are learning from others, others can also learn from you.
Totally agree, Miss Burnell. Should you outline your short story before writing it, or can you just start with just an idea?
I've done both to varying effects. The stories that have taken less time for me to write, when it comes down to brass tacks, the ones that have taken less editing, in my experience, have been the ones that I laid out a little. I use ClickUp. ClickUp is a productivity app. It's actually, meant for businesses and teamwork and things like that. But I use ClickUp to outline my stuff. And I have different lists and I could put things in different places and I have a whiteboard and I have all of those kinds of things. And I'm able to kind of make a short outline for everything I want. And for me, the most bare bones outline is who is it? What do they want in the beginning? And what do they want in the end? And then my other question being, what do I want the readers to feel? And I have not necessarily, when I started that story, gone 250 words and then this is going to happen, then 250 words more and then that is going to happen, and then 500 words later this is going to happen, and then all of a sudden we have this integration of, you can do that. You can structure your plots to the point of, say, what I learned how to do in script writing in film school, where you're like, okay, at exactly this kind of timeline in the movie, there needs to be a beat change. Exactly this kind of timeline in the movie, there needs to be a climactic rise. Exactly this time in the movie, it's going to be a little bit of a softer scene because that's usually when people need to go to the bathroom or, refill their popcorn. There's a structure that is quite firm depending on the genre that you're in. You don't have to be that firm, I don't think, unless you want to be. I've known some people who write like that. All power to them. You do you. That is, fantastic. You can be incredibly detailed. But for me, I always start a story knowing at least who the main character is, where they start, and where I want them to end up. That's it. Otherwise, I find that the rabbit trails that I go through will end up taking me so much longer in the end than if I had just sat down with an intention. And two, I think readers, for the most part, can, unless it's done incredibly well, they can sense when a writer did not necessarily know where the story was going to go until about halfway through. They can sense that because the pacing is off most of the time, unless it's done really well, which it can be. But
did you apply those attributes to your latest anthology, Macabre and the Lenses?
Yes, I did. So Macabre and Monstrous, I planned out Whiskey and Sinner's Blood. I had this outline for years. Well, I actually had the short story itself. I had the first version of it. And this is where I'll tell you. When I first wrote the story that was called Lavender Blue, which turned into Whiskey and Sinner's Blood, it did not have an outline. It was just, let's start on this adventure and see where I go. And you can see how that affected the writing style because it took about 7 years to get to a point where I could publish it. I basically rewrote the entire thing with an outline and then it worked. So, speaking from some experience in that one, that was one of the first short stories I had written in the Judge of Mystics world. I love those sort of pared down intentional, outlines. With the Cottonmouth Smile, it started with a motif. It started with this one image of a device meant to take this genetically modified super soldier and keep him in prison. And well, okay, yeah, but how do you do that? How do you do it? You have to restrict movement. You have to restrict oxygen, because giant muscles, all these kinds of things, they take oxygen in order to function. So I started from that image of this device meant to keep Tristram in the prison cell. And of course, he's in there under no fault of his own because of the great villain that's going to be happening in the Leben cycle and the whole thing, but the main thing was that motif. And then working around that, the question of how do you keep a mind imprisoned came to me. And so I knew that this story was going to be about Tristram physically imprisoned and then mentally shackled by the end. And so what would motivate, that sort of mental shackle? Well, usually the hope of rescue and then a kind of shattering of that hope in a way, or even just a doubt of that hope. And this is a horror anthology, so it was meant to be a horror story. So I should say that I don't normally write things that are that depressing. Um, but with him, I had that motif. I had where I needed to go. And then I added in Lima, who is Tristram's love interest in a future Lebenscycle book. And then it was okay, there we go. And then I just sat down in one session and I wrote it out. Like all 8,000 words. It was done in a couple of hours. But I had those elements that I knew. And then it was time to give my chicken scratch to my editor and talk some things through and edit and then have it go from there. With the Lamia, the same thing. I started with Caleb Matheson, this kind of, man in authority, la 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 la, and then something in the Lamia, in the first part of the Lamia, shakes him. It shakes him desperately and to the core. And then he has to figure out from there how he's not only going to live his life, but how he's going to raise his daughters. Because it's not just, XYZ thing happened in history, and so certain people should feel guilty. It's how do I raise my girls so this never happens again? How do I be a single dad and a good father? How do I make sure that these girls are taken care of? And it is a monster story. It is a story with a fight in it. It's a story where it starts off with him dragging himself through West 12th and almost to Granville Street in Vancouver, trying to get to people so the monster doesn't get him. It has all those kind of monster epic kind of things. Inside, though, it's a story about fatherhood and what it takes for a man to make sure that when he looks at his girls, he knows he is giving them the world and that they have the ability to take hold of that, go, thanks, daddy, and then take it even farther and be even greater and be even better. So that was kind of the mental package, the gift wrap that I put around the story. The rest of it kind of flowed from there because everything was referring back to that ideal. Everything was referring back either as a cautionary tale or as part of the dialogue. It had a point. It had a perspective line. I think outlines to me are a little bit like when you're painting a picture or you're drawing something and you put that perspective dot on the page right in the beginning. Like if you're using Procreate or something like that, and I use Procreate for my art. I'll sometimes put those guidelines on and I'll just pick the perspective, whether it's 1 or 2 point perspective. I'll pick those perspective lines. That's what an outline is. It's not the drawing itself. But without those perspective lines, something might look a little off. Something might be a bit off kilter. Something might not fit the perspective that you're going for as much. And you might have to edit and adjust a little bit more than you would have necessarily otherwise if you didn't have it. So it's a little guide. It's not the whole thing. You can obviously modify as you go, and there's plenty of people I know who write, they just start with an idea and then they just go until it's finished. But especially with short fiction, I find you need to be intentional with everything, and intentionality also includes an outline, in my perspective and in my opinion. So
Yes. Well done, Miss Burnell. And I'm inviting you to listen to my other podcast, Food 101, our fourth season with Chef Alessandro, one of the best executive chef in one of five-star restaurant in downtown Toronto. So one more, our books are out, not only one, but 13 volumes. People, Food 101, Volume 1 Basics until 13 is the books that you need. How to create a delicious food. Available on Amazon and leading online bookstores worldwide. So, Miss Burnell, can you please invite our listeners to support your two anthologies?
hello, everybody. Thank you so much for listening today. As we said, my name is Sapha Burnell. You can find my website at saphaburnell.com. That is SAPHABURNELL.com. You will be able to find links to all of my works of fiction, all of my books, including Lenses, Macabre and Monstrous, Futures Lens, and then Usurper Kings, which is my poetry collection as well. And I also have information on my novels and my TTRPG one-shot, Coco Craze, on there, which is a kid-friendly 60 to 90-minute tabletop game that you can play with your family this holiday season. All of that is available at saphaburnell.com and anywhere books are sold. And I would really
Yes.
appreciate it if everyone, if you found something, there's probably something that
There
you
is. Yes. Definitely for gift, people, for last minute gift. If you are interested to books, recommend Miss Burnell novels and anthology. Let's support her because if you support her, more anthology and novel to come.
yeah. I love to hear the sounds of that. Thank you.
50, 100 more books to come from Miss Burnell. Okay, people? And the audiobook is also available for your novels, Miss Burnell, right?
We are actually working on the audiobooks now. We would have had a couple out before Christmas, but oh, I am actually narrating the audiobooks myself. No, that is not something every author necessarily can do or should do. I'll just put it that way. But I do have a history of performance and voice acting, so we will be getting a couple of those audiobooks out within the next couple of months, just as I recover. So you'll be able to hear Caleb Matheson and Charisma and Caroline Culm have that epic husband and wife fight in Whiskey and Sinner's Blood,
I
where he
love
keeps
that.
trying to pour her whiskey. You'll hear those as quote unquote intended. I'll say quote unquote intended. Everybody has their own flavor, but it'll be a lot of fun.
Yes, looking forward to it.
Mhm.
Miss Burnell and Bodyguard people, see you soon.